All right, we are live. So we're still 0 participants. So we'll quickly wait until the first ones come in. Usually takes a little bit. Hello and welcome to the first participants. We'll wait another 2 to 3 minutes before we start. So go grab a coffee and make yourself comfortable. We start in a few minutes. Again, to everyone who's just joining, we'll wait another 2-3 minutes before everyone has settled in and locked in. So grab a coffee, make yourself comfortable. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to the second installment of the Fireside Chat, the UX Fireside Chat. So maybe to get started and see who is joining today, type in your name and where you come from and maybe where you work at into the chat. So we see that it's not all dead here, and I can see that it works on your end as well. The chat is on the right side of your window. Okay, nobody so far. Nilo from Berlin. Nice, welcome Nilo. Sonil from Aviva, Zurich. Sarah from Zurich, nice. Chloe from London. Again, a very diverse audience. So I think we can get started. So welcome to our second Fireside Chat. Today it will be all about ethics in design and UX in specific. So this is sort of a new format that we do where we interview the movers and shakers of the UX scene from all over the world and hear about their thought-provoking ideas. So how this will go down is we'll have a 30 to 40 minute sort of interview together. And then at the very end, we'll have time for your questions. So please, in the chat on the right side, you can enter your questions, and then we'll get to them in the end. And so, learning from last week, we'll take a little bit more time to answer all the questions. So feel free to post them whenever you have one. Okay, so I am Sandro from Testing Time. I will be your host today. Testing Time is a Europe-wide test user recruitment service with a pool of over 180,000 test users. On our platform, testingtime.com, you can go online, define your target group, and we'll provide you with the matching study participants within 48 hours. And we do this in collaboration with UX Live. So UX Live is a UX conference series sort of positioned at the intersection of design, research, and technology. And the next event will actually be in London next week on October 25th and 26th. So if you don't have a ticket yet, you can still go to ux-live.co and grab one of the last ones. And also our second guest, Kenneth Bowles, is present at the UX Live conference next week. He will do a presentation and a workshop. We'll go into that a little bit more in a few minutes. So welcome, Kenneth. Do you want to tell our audience a bit about what you do and what your background is?
Sure thing. Thanks, Andre. Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon, or whatever time zones you're in. So I'm Kenneth. I'm a London-based designer and writer. I call myself both these days. I'm kind of having an identity crisis. I don't know which I am. I'm probably both. What do I do? I'm still trying to figure that out at the moment. I'm as I say, I'm going through one of those recalibrations, but my background has been interaction design, product design. I call myself a lapster. I don't personally call myself a UX designer anymore, but I certainly used to. And you know, my history is agencies, governments, startups, large tech giants. I've pretty much done them all, sort of 15 years or so into my career now. And my focus now is the ethics of technology. I've spent about 2 or 3 years looking at that. I won't get too into that because I'm sure there will be further questions about that to come. But that's where I find myself at the moment, writing, designing, consulting around that kind of space, particularly with a focus on emerging technology, and particularly with a focus on design and product management and the intersection of those with ethics.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kenneth. So I would say then let's dive right in. So you, as you mentioned, you wrote a book on the future of ethics. Why did you write this book, and why is it important to you?
Sure. So the book's it's about the future of ethics, but it's also about the ethics of the future. And those are subtly different, but both very important things. Why did I write it? I felt it was necessary. I heard it said once that you should always write a book whose absence hurts you. You know, in the book, if there's a gap where you're desperately thinking there should be something here, then you may have to write it yourself. I've also heard it said that you should write the book that you would have needed 5 years ago. And I absolutely needed this book 5 years ago, and I didn't really appreciate that at the time. So I wrote it because I have always had an interest in the ethical side of design and technology, but I previously never really understood that field. It was, you know, I was sort of interested in ethics a little bit as a young man, but didn't have any grounding in it. I don't have a philosophy major or anything like that. And that seed just kept growing in my mind, essentially. I spent 3 years at Twitter. I was the design manager for Twitter in the UK, so heading up the London team there. And then when I left that position, the timing seemed right to investigate this topic more thoroughly, to give it the time and attention that I felt it deserved. And that was maybe 2 or 3 years ago now. And in that time, I've been fortunate enough that the industry as a whole has become very interested in this topic, for reasons I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. And I've just been fortunate that intersection has worked. So I now have people who are interested in this topic as well, who are now seeking me out and trying to say, well, what have you learned? How can we try and change our practices? And if there's something I can offer to those folks, then I'm a lucky man. I've just accidentally stumbled into something that has proven to be particularly popular at the moment.
So yeah, I mean, it's always nice to see when it also what you do, that it resonates with other people in the industry too. So when you say ethical, how does that sort of translate into where most of our audience is present? So in the fields of UX or ethical design specifically, can you make a few examples? What does it mean to be ethical?
Sure. Sometimes there's a very obvious link. Dark pattern, things like that. I mean, everyone on this call, I'm sure, is familiar with the idea of a dark pattern, named by Harry Brignall. This is an intentionally deceptive interface, right? And we've probably all been asked to design them, to ship them. We've all probably at some point tried to argue against them. Perhaps we've won, perhaps we've lost. So I think we're all familiar with that tactical angle of ethical design. There are perhaps more subtle ways that that ethics weaves its way through the work we do as well, however. Any act of design, whether it's a dark pattern, whether it's designing weapons, whatever it is, or even just designing paper clips or a web interface, any act of design is a statement about the future. Designers have this luxury that we're always thinking about, well, how should society orientate itself in future? How should it interact with technology? What affordances should that technology have to reveal what is in the world around us? How should it shape our interactions with the world and by extension with each other? So that's there has to be a clear ethical component to that. If we're making a statement for how we as a society should live, of course we have to find a role for ethics within that. Now, at the same time, whenever we take that decision as designers to choose the preferred future, we're also discarding tens of thousands of other futures. So we're saying this is the route that we think our user base, our company, our society should follow. There are discussions to have as to whether we are the right people to be making those kind of calls. But for now, a lot of that responsibility falls on us. So we have a duty to see that we take those decisions seriously. For me, ethics is really a pledge to take our most important decisions about how we should live, taking those decisions as seriously as they should be.
Can you make one or two concrete examples where something is ethical and how you can make it more ethical? Maybe in the digital space, for example.
Well, I mean, there are almost too many examples to choose from. Let's think of one. LinkedIn had to settle a dark pattern class action lawsuit. Email that purported to come from friends had actually come from LinkedIn. They got taken to court. They had to settle out of court for $13 million. Uber have been long regarded, it's changing a little bit now, but under Travis Kalanick, they were long regarded as a company, almost a poster child, essentially, for unethical behavior. And that went all the way through the company culture, from threatening smear campaigns against journalists to deceptive interface patterns, like when you open the app and you see the cars on the map. Of course, as we now know, those cars aren't there. They're there to give the impression of abundance. But perhaps the example that people know the most, or that caused the biggest stir at the time, was Facebook's study into what they called emotional contagion. They have plenty of research scientists, and they collaborated with Stanford University to try and manipulate the emotions of 689,000 people. And they did this by changing the contents of newsfeed to say, well, if we show people happier content or sad content, they'd run their sentiment analysis algorithms against that content. Will that in turn affect the sentiment of the things that people post? So can emotion essentially be communicated through newsfeed from peer groups to individuals? And they found that yes, it could, by a very, very small degree, but yes, it could. The big problem with this, they didn't have consent to do this piece of research. Mm-hmm. They claimed they had a little item in the terms of service that allowed them to do it, but this is user research, and anything conducted on that sort of scale needs informed consent, and particularly with regard to manipulating emotions. I mean, you're intentionally trying to make people happier or sad without any interest in whether they have existing conditions like depression or anxiety. So that particularly angered me, I would say, that one. So I think that was perhaps one of the most prominent. But as I say, I mean, there are so many examples. I could probably take the whole seminar, the whole webinar, just talking about the negative examples. So your second part of the question, I could spend an entire book writing about, because that's the trick, isn't it? Is how do you then transform that? How do you try to turn that around? And perhaps we need to break that down into some smaller questions, because there are so many approaches all the way through the design process that I think you can start to employ.
Can you maybe start at, okay, so I'm basically at ground zero. I have not really thought about this topic too much. Where do I start? What are some quick wins? How can I sort of in the long term implement it strategically in our company, and also raise the awareness in a company to go towards more ethical design?
Sure. Okay. Obviously, where you should start is you should buy Future Ethics by Kenneth Bowles. However, I mean, quick wins are seductive, and they don't always work for ethics. They're kind of the opposite of ethics. I think our industry has a frankly infuriating desire to try and take a shortcut around everything, to life hack their way, to growth hack their way around difficult philosophical, social problems. Ethics is one of those problems. Now, there are short-term things you can do, and I would say I'd focus particularly on the critique process. A healthy critique process is essential, I think, to the ethical discussion within a company, to the ethical health of a company, if you like. Something that Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher talk about, they wrote a book called Design for Real Life, and they talk about the idea of a designated dissenter. So this is someone in a team who is there essentially to be, I would call them a constructive pain in the arse. They're there to subvert the decisions that the team has taken, to challenge the assumptions that have gone into product design. So an example might be, say you're asking for marital status. The designated dissenter can role play as, well, let's say I'm going through a messy divorce, and, how dare you ask me this? Why do I need to tell you? Don't make me go through that emotional, or climb that emotional rock face, if you like. So the designated dissenter is to sort of lob in these little grenades of defiance from the edges of the process, and just to start those discussions going, which will challenge teams to see things from different perspectives. So I think that's something that people can start doing straight away. You want to rotate that role, of course. You don't want one person to be the dissenter for a year, but there are little things like that. But I'll return to the point I was making before. If you're looking for quick, easy fixes around ethics, you are missing the point, because it's quick, easy fixes that have got us where we are. It's
exactly
that have caused all of these problems. So we have to fundamentally reprioritize and commit to learning about this and finding a way to convince our colleagues and our superiors to take these decisions seriously, and again, not look for elastoplast solutions for the problem. So
I read one of your blog posts around sort of ethical design sprints. And in there you say ethical design actually leads to better products. Can you explain that? Because I think that's also an argument that works well in the business world, right? So that we can sort of show that ethics is actually leading to better products for the user.
So there are a couple of things wrapped up in this. One is, there is a business case to be made for ethics, should you wish to do that. Essentially, you can only ever make 3 business cases for something. You can either earn more money, you can reduce cost, or you can reduce risk. Every other business case translates to one of those. So you can earn more money, of course, through ethical products. Generally, people pay more for them. Customer retention will often be higher. Word of mouth marketing. Well, this is a cost thing, I suppose. I'll save that for the second category. In fact, let's move on to that second category. So reducing cost. Of course, there are cost reductions in terms of repeat customers, in terms of word of mouth referrals, as I was talking about. Generally, a product that respects people's attention, that respects people's time and intentions using the service, will usually be one that scores higher in things like Net Promoter or customer satisfaction scores. And so your marketing costs, in theory, go down, because word of mouth marketing is significantly cheaper, of course, than expensive advertising. And then reducing risk of customer backlash, risk of regulatory backlash, which is becoming a strong issue, particularly in the EU. So there are plenty of ways that you can, if you like, sell it as an idea. I think that is a somewhat risky strategy, because if you make an ethical business case and that's the only thing you have is the financial benefit, then you may win that particular battle, but you'll lose the war, because the next time someone will come along with a far bigger gain from a dark pattern, and you won't be able to challenge it on logical or emotional or ethical grounds. So there are hard bottom line implications, but as you say, for me, it's also about just making better products, and in turn thereby making a better world. I mean, this is something that designers all, I think, pretty much believe in, that we have this slightly higher calling to improve society and to make the world a little bit more humane and usable. And the way I like to think about that is that ethics can be a constraint on the design process. Now, when a business person hears a constraint, they think of a straitjacket, right? They think of something that inhibits something you want to do, something that puts, excessive control. But designers, we recognize that's not how constraints work. We know that they absolutely will trim some branches, right? There will be some things if we impose, or if we, not impose, that's the wrong word, but if we if we agree that ethics should be central to how we build products, that will mean that we don't build certain things in certain ways. But it can also be a seed of innovation, not just a pair of shears. It's not just cutting off things that aren't working or that don't fit those criteria. It can be a lens, a way of thinking about problems that actually in turn generates its own solutions. So that for me is the heart of it. So there's a business case, but it's really a reframing of ethics, not as something that always opposes progress, but something that goes along with progress and just changes the perspectives on which we see problems. And I think when companies start to get that, we'll be in a far better place, frankly, as an industry.
Do you have some examples of companies that are doing this well, respectively, are going in the right direction?
Basically, no. I get asked that a lot. We've reached a pretty bad point, I think, as an industry. We've let the ideologies and assumptions of the industry, particularly in Silicon Valley, take us down certain routes that have made it very hard to design in ethical ways. I do see some green shoots actually surprisingly in the tech giants. I think Google's recent work on AI is very focused on privacy protecting or privacy enhancing technologies, on device processing. They recognize that the centralization of data in, say, the cloud comes with risks. So they're trying very hard actually to reverse that trajectory. Apple, of course, are doing a bunch of stuff around privacy. Now, for them, it happens to sell more devices, which is, of course, their primary business. So whether they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart or whether they're doing it because they recognize that's a way they can differentiate against the Facebooks and Googles of this world, I don't know, you tell me. I think Uber have made some interesting moves since getting rid of Travis Kalanick. They've clearly become a toxic brand. They're trying desperately to shed that mantle. The rebrand, I think, a couple of weeks ago, is entirely orientated around just trying to appear different as a company. But they have undone some of the harmful decisions that they made previously around things like tracking. And then also at the operating system level, anyone who's on iOS 12 or Android, I forget which version of Android you're up to, I'm afraid. But now we have some attentional controls in there. iOS 12 has screen time, so you can see, well, just how much am I using this device? How much is it dragging me away from the other priorities in my life? And actually, that's a direct result of Tristan Harris and his work at the Center of Humane Technology, the Time Well Spent movement. So these things are starting to bed in a little bit, but there's certainly not one company that will point at and say, look, these folks are doing it the absolute right way. Perhaps someone like Dropbox. I was at Dropbox last week in San Francisco. They get it. They're definitely keen to move in that direction. But that's a question I'll be better equipped to answer, I think, in a year, once these changes have really started to bed in.
And what have you seen sort of in the industry itself? Does sort of ethical changes, does it often come from the outside because of pressure, like in the Uber case, or are there also examples, how you just mentioned with Tristan Harris, who does a lot in this for this topic to move it forward? What's the usual case? I mean, do we have, as consumers, also have the power, so to speak out and say, hey, can we not change that?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of questions wrapped up in that. So consumers absolutely have power. However, the idea that the market will solve ethical problems is a myth, because that only works if the market knows what's going on inside technologies. Now, we may know that because we're technologists, but the general public doesn't have a clue what's happening inside their Amazon Echoes, inside Facebook, all these devices that they buy and connect, the IoT smart homey stuff. So they don't know if it's behaving in an unethical way or not. They can't suddenly decide en masse, well, we'll just refuse to use these technologies, right? So a lot of the pressure does have to come from people inside companies. And believe me, that's been going on for years. I mean, this idea that there's only recently been an ethical renaissance, or well, not even renaissance, but an ethical swelling of interest. I mean, I alluded to it at the start, but it's more complex than that. When I was at Twitter, there were deep debates about things that I would now say are ethical design questions. However, the industry has a nature of, once they've made a decision, they hide all that, of course. They have a nice PR comsy face on it and say, well, this is the decision we've taken, and they pretend there was no internal dissent whatsoever. But employees are starting to affect significant change. If we look at Google, the Project Maven, it's a drone targeting project, Pentagon project that their AI teams were working on. That has been cancelled as a direct result of internal employee pressure. They had an open letter that was signed by hundreds or thousands of Googlers. They had several resignations over it. And eventually, leadership team recognized that this was essentially acting against the core values of the organization and elected not to pursue that project. And they've actually just pulled out of another Department of Defense project on similar grounds. So employees, designers particularly, are quite mobilized about this sort of stuff. So that can affect change from the inside as well as consumer pressure. The third group I should mention here is regulators. There absolutely will be more regulation of our industry within the next 5 to 10 years. If you're in Europe, it's already here. You've already seen GDPR. Even that's just the start of it. The British government has been talking about imposing a tax on tech giants. They've also been talking about doing that by this Christmas. So they haven't got long to get that through Parliament, if there is a Parliament at that stage. But the ship has sailed essentially on regulation for the European tech industry. At the moment, of course, the appetite in the US is different. They're in a deregulatory mode. But depending on what happens at the midterms, there may be regulation around data protection. California, for instance, just passed a bill making it illegal for a bot to pretend to be human under certain circumstances, political or commercial, I believe. SB 101 was the name of the bill, if you want to read that. So it's starting to creep in. So there's going to be public pressure, there's going to be internal pressure, and there's going to be regulatory pressure. So all of those things are going to combine to potentially make for a pretty big shift, I would say.
Do you have some examples of how this worked within Twitter, for example, since you work there and we all know the company? Some decisions that have been taken towards ethics, and maybe also one example against ethics. If you can talk about that. Okay.
I'm still somewhat under NDA. I don't know exactly how long my I think probably forever, probably until the day I die. I'll talk about something that I've talked about publicly previously and that was reported in the press. I'll talk about positive examples first. I joined Twitter because I felt of all the tech companies, all the major tech companies out there, it was having the most impact on global culture and it felt the most ethically aligned. At the time I joined, they were very strong on core values. They were very strong on protecting people's privacy, not yielding to government requests, excessive, vexatious requests for user data. And actually, I saw that borne out. Twitter has a set of core values. I think there are 10 of them or 9 of them. And I could probably still list them all if I, scratched my head long enough. And they lived by them. They actually believed in them. And one of them was defend and respect the user's voice. And so there are a number of decisions around how do we protect the user from it? Again, those particularly government requests, not just US and UK and Europe, but particularly governments in repressive regimes who wanted Twitter to unmask protesters or dissidents. Of course, Twitter's role in the Arab Spring, the revolutions there, was well documented, but there have been many countries that have asked Twitter to essentially to grass on people and to pretty much ensure that they'd have the police sent round. And Twitter considered those carefully. And sometimes there is a legal requirement to do that. For instance, it is illegal to promote neo-Nazism in Germany. So, there is a legal obligation there. But generally, Twitter sided with the user against some of those requests. And I felt at the time that was quite a deeply moral choice. Mm-hmm. The flip side of that is, of course, that culture and that way of orientating has meant that they've also tended to permit a bunch of speech on the platform that's been plain hateful. They're now dealing with the implications of that, and I wish them all the best because that's a tough problem. But also, it's their own making. They've been very slow to act on that problem. But one example I'll talk about, which was one I think the company got it wrong, was. And again, this reported in the press, so this is nothing too confidential. Twitter essentially found a way to learn which apps were installed on users' phones. You're not meant to be able to do that. That's sort of sandboxed, particularly in iOS. I'm assuming it is in Android, but I don't know the situation. And there was an internal discussion on one of the message boards saying, well, I think we should do this. We've found we can do it. Benefits to advertisers, of course, in knowing what apps are installed, but also benefit for the user. A very, very small, pathetic benefit, frankly, for me. But nevertheless, it was used to try and excuse it, of essentially better deep linking between services. Like if you have Uber installed, we can send you deep with an Uber, or if Dropbox or whatever it is. And significant internal discussion about this, and I was on the side that was opposed to it because I felt it violated the user's expectations of privacy, and I lost. We lost that debate. It shipped, and probably can't say too much about exactly what caused the change of heart, but within a couple of months, Twitter had reversed that decision, shall we say. Not entirely of their own decision. There were other influences on the reversal of that decision. And of course, I felt, well, that's good. Felt a little bit annoyed we hadn't been listened to. But it goes to show that, the case, the cause, I suppose, of ethics never runs smooth. You will lose more fights than you win, certainly to begin with. So one of the things I'm trying to do is equip people with the skills and the language and the framework for making a case for why these things matter. And eventually, with time, I think as an industry, we'll get better at that and we'll start to make a stronger case for putting ethics first.
So your book is basically about the future of ethics, right? And so, when I'm thinking about it today, I just also recently read an article from Tristan Harris, which we mentioned before, where he sort of goes into detail from certain apps, like when you swipe down and then it reloads, that this is sort of the casino slot machine effect and stuff like that. So if we just think about that very feature and how it makes us addicted to technology, it's everywhere today. So where do you think where we'll end up in 10, 15 years with such technology?
Sure.
Yes, and which sort of areas will it touch most or first?
Sure. Okay. Again, I could talk about this for a while. Something interesting about the pull to refresh gesture that you mentioned there.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't know that that's actually owned by Twitter. Twitter owns the patent for it.
Okay.
It was designed by a guy called Lauren Brichter, who made a third-party client called Tweety. Old school Twitter users might remember Tweety. It was the first really good iOS client, and it had the pull to refresh gesture, and it was entirely Lauren's invention. And then Twitter bought it. Twitter bought him and the company and the client, and yeah, they own the patent. So in theory, they could sue and to prevent anyone else from having that in their app. But Twitter have a defensive patents policy. They don't go after people. They only use it to defend if someone comes after them. Which again, I quite liked when I joined them. I thought that's a responsible and moral way to handle that. Where this takes us in 10 years, well, for me, addictive technology is really about persuasion. It's technology that's so good at pushing your buttons that it's persuading you to come back and use it more, right? And persuasive technology, I think, has some fairly alarming futures. We're already seeing, of course, the influence of persuasive technology in the 2016 electoral cycles, in Brexit and the US election. We've seen, obviously, the accusations, the frankly very realistic accusations afterwards that it was state-sponsored manipulation. We've seen Facebook's appalling role in the genocide that's happening in Myanmar. And these systems will only, with time, get to know us better. They'll have access to increasing amounts of data about us, but they'll also be dynamic. They'll be able to change their persuasive strategies depending on what works and what doesn't. And most importantly, they'll be networked. So they will be able to learn not just from you, but from what works across, 100 million, 1 billion people. So I think we could end up in a situation where technology becomes a potent manipulator. And this is something that Karen Young, who's a legal scholar in London, she says that should be called a hypernudge system. This is something based off the idea of nudge theory, which we all know, essentially saying now it's going to be so powerful and so different from what came before that it needs its own name, hypernudge. And that's a particularly dystopian future, actually, for persuasion, because we won't know it's happening. We won't be able to recognize who's doing the persuading. We won't be able to recognize how they're trying to persuade us in whatever direction. And that means we can't protest, right? We can't collectivize, and we can't, as a general public, say we shouldn't do this. Now, previous forms of media, things like advertising, you had an ombudsman, you've got an authority, you can say this is misleading advertising, and I'll go in and I'll pull it. Can't do that if the algorithm is tailored to every single individual. So there are risks, I think, that unless we have either a push for exposure of who's doing the persuasion and what are their persuasive intents, or if there's regulation to that effect, persuasive technologies could essentially start to diminish our free will, start to diminish our own autonomy as individuals, and that becomes a pretty scary prospect. So sorry to get all dystopian, but that's if things go horribly wrong.
And which fields do you see most affected right now with ethical questions? I'm thinking like AI or drones or autonomous driving and so forth.
Yeah, sure. So autonomous vehicles and AI are probably the two emerging technologies that have the most visible ethical questions. Of course, my contention is that they all have. Every technology has ethical questions, but there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the AI ethics field around algorithmic bias. But how do we try to identify that? How do we mitigate it where possible, remove it, expunge it from our systems? There are plenty of interesting and very difficult philosophical sort of far future questions around AI. At what point do we say that artificial intelligences need rights? Should we give robot rights? Should we give people legal or moral personhood? There's a robot called Sophia that probably people on the call, many of them will know. It's nowhere near an intelligent being. It's essentially it's a tape recorder in a rubber mask. I hate it, but it's a citizen of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia have made it a citizen of that country. As a PS robot actually has more rights in that country than women do, in some ways. But there are legitimate questions behind it. At what point do we say this entity becomes, a legal entity in its own right, much like a company? A company is a legal person, so maybe robots will be as well. So there's a bunch of stuff, and then the really seductive, sexy stuff like will they kill us all, and the singularity, is it coming, and all that. And I think those are fascinating questions, and there are very intelligent people working on them. But I think they can distract us from the things that are a bit closer to home. One of those is coming back to the autonomous vehicles. We always hear about the trolley problem, this idea of who should the car strike, who should the vehicle strike if a crash is inevitable? Should it, kill one child or two old people, or things like that? In truth, that actually isn't a problem you just break. The trolley problem has never come up in a real world test scenario to this point. But there are some very interesting questions around how do we apportion blame in these systems?
Who's responsible?
Who's responsible? Because technologies dilute responsibility. The user may be at fault if it's a semi-autonomous vehicle. Perhaps they didn't patch the firmware. Maybe a cyclist pulled out dangerously in front of them. But we also have to look at what's the software engineering team? Who signed off on it? What's the the bug detection processes? How do things get approved? Were the road signs clearly visible? Because of course, these systems use cameras to detect road signs and interpret them. They don't have a master database of all road conditions. And then we have to say, well, were the regulators acting responsibly in letting this vehicle on the road? There was an Uber self-driving car killed a woman in Arizona this year. There is a strong case that the regulators should take some of the blame for that, for letting a clearly immature technology onto public roads. And Uber should absolutely take some blame, and they have for it as well. So the questions around autonomous vehicles are actually probably not the ones that are, the trolley problem, sexy, well-known ones. There are much more interesting, deeper, thornier questions than that. So I'd say probably those two categories, but as I'd argue, pretty much every technology has its ethical components.
Okay. 40 minutes already passed. That went very fast again. Thank you very, very much for your insights. Sure. So you will also be talking about the future of ethics at UX Live this year.
That's right.
What sort of will be the focus there? And you also do a workshop. So if you can quickly talk about those two,
sure thing.
That would be interesting for everyone who's attending.
Okay. So the talk will be riffing on some of the same themes that we've talked about today, but focusing a bit more on those dedicated steps within the design process that I talked about. And I said there's too much to kind of include in one question. You should probably refer to the talk for that. But going through steps in the design process, saying, well, where are opportunities for us to look at things through an ethical perspective? Are there techniques we can draw upon from? I'm particularly interested in the roles of critical design and speculative design there. So drawing on some of those ideas. I think they can be powerful approaches, and also introducing some ethical theory, because we aren't the first people on these shores, right? There have been ethicists for a couple of millennia, so it's about time we listened to what they've been telling us, trying to tell us, and are still trying to tell us, and watching us, run into the same walls again and again. While they're just listen, we have ideas. So trying to introduce some of their theories in a way that makes it tangible and sort of realistic for working designers and product managers. So that's the talk. The workshop is nothing to do with ethics at all. I'm running a workshop on prototyping and prototyping motion using Keynote, because you can, and it's actually really quite good, and it's super easy. But just there's so much hidden inside Keynote that people don't know about, and I've stumbled across it, or I've worked with people who've known that software well. Apple use it to prototype their software. And so I'm just going to do a 2-hour thing showing essentially some of the hidden secrets of Keynote and how you can use builds and Magic Move and so on to do, convincing motion prototyping. So totally different. It's going to be a very significant change of pace.
Interesting. So everyone who hasn't signed up yet for the workshop can still do that. And also, I think there will be recordings of each talk. So reach out to us if you have if you want to see that. So final questions before we go into the Q&A. Do you have some favorite books, online resources, and or tools that you use that you swear by?
I've got a couple of books, because we talked about this just a little bit before, and so I brought them up so I could show. They're not really to do with ethics; they're just really good books. So I'm just going to recommend Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. As we know, system thinking is terrifically important for designers, but it's kind of hard to get a grasp of what it is. So that book for me was just like a one-way valve for seeing the world. Totally different way to see everything in terms of systems and to understand how they behave and how you can intervene in systems. So that was brilliant. This is a bit more ethical. This is Four Futures by Peter Fraze. I'll recommend that. It's looking at, as the name suggests, 4 different trajectories that we could be on. What might happen if we don't solve inequality, and if we don't solve the climate crisis, and then looking at various intersections of that. Some of them are dystopian, some of them are utopian, and really opened my eyes. And then the final one I'll throw in is Speculative Everything. This is by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby. They were previously at the Royal College of Art in London, and they are known very much for speculative design, design fiction, critical design, which I am absolutely positive is something the industry needs to know about over the next couple of years and will be an important part of the industry soon enough. I think we'll probably seize upon a lot of those ideas and frankly ruin them. But for those who do it right, that sort of work is going to be a very interesting way to tease out ideas around the future of technology and of our world, and then to try to change those things for the better.
Thanks a bunch. Never heard of these books. I'm definitely gonna
check
them out. Yes. So let's get into the Q&A. We have Nilofar who asked the question, how would you keep the balance between ethical design and business interest? Any suggestions how to convince the clients that ethic makes the product more successful?
This is the question I get asked more than any other. As I said before, there are business cases, so you can try and put a dollar value on stuff or a euro value or whatever it is. I don't recommend it, or I don't recommend it as the only strategy. As I mentioned, essentially you'll lose. We have to make rhetorical, emotional, and logical appeals. We cannot simply say that profit is the only thing that we're working for as a company. If you're in a company that doesn't care about anything apart from profit, you will make no headway at all in getting ethics introduced in that organization, because that is fundamentally an amoral, not immoral, but amoral environment where morality just doesn't come into it. It's all about whatever maximizes the profit. So, I mean, one way to do it is rise up the chain, right? Become chief exec or the VP of whatever, and then make the world as you see fit. The problem is that's a sort of 10 to 15 year strategy. Mm-hmm. For me, the most effective strategy is to find moral allies. One individual can stand up and try and push for what they think is right, trying to make a case for something. But if you're that sole individual, eventually they'll find a way to root around you, right? They'll start not inviting you to meetings, and eventually they'll find a way to fire you. So you have to have strength in numbers to an extent. Google, as I say, did this with Project Maven. Find enough people who are able to stand up and say, I'm concerned about this as well. Now, it doesn't have to be that you fold your arms and say, I'm going to refuse to do this. There may be occasions where that's necessary. But to say, are there different ways we can tackle this same problem, but with ethics as a lens, as a seed of innovation, as a constraint on the process, not as a directly opposing force necessarily, and see where that takes us. But I mean, that is the classic question. And the main thing for me is you've got to convince the business that there are other things to value in this life, and even in business, than just pure short-term profit. There are intangibles that have enormous value.
Thank you. Next question from Katja. How do you actually define ethics and ethical design? What's sort of your definition? Maybe a short, crisp definition, if someone asks you.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because we haven't had an answer to that for 2,000 years. Ethics. So ethics for me, so one thing I'd like to just mention is sometimes people see a difference between ethics and morals. A lot of people, if you ask, they'll think, well, ethics is something to do with society's expectations and morality is more internal, more innate. The good news is most philosophers actually don't make a difference. A couple of them do, but the vast majority use those interchangeably, which is great, simplifies things. Ethics is about deciding how we should behave, how we should act. And of course, that makes it a terrifically broad subject. I would say when we start doing it in aggregate as a society, it's not really ethics, it's more politics then. That's how do we structure society? How do we want to behave as a nation? Things like that. Those are political questions as much as ethical questions. But ethics is the choice of how to live. What is a life well lived? How do we define that, and how do we achieve that as individuals? So the design ethics is just that, but with design put in front of it, right? How do we design well? How do we define what a good professional is, what a good designer is, and how do we try to take steps toward that ideal? But yeah, defining the thing of ethics, there are books written about it, and they're not very interesting books.
Yeah, okay. So actually, sort of following up on that question a bit, what's your view on sort of accountability for the designer? Do you think designers should have to get a qualification for designing certain products? This is a question from Michael.
Sure. Okay. Two slightly separate things I'll separate here. Accountability, yeah, we should absolutely have accountability. The design industry has, frankly, lied to itself about accountability. We say we want it, but then when it actually lands, we don't want it. The difficulty is designers generally aren't accountable. The person who is accountable is the product manager. Product managers are accountable. Designers generally aren't. And for me, that suggests that more designers should work in product management, bluntly. Or if you want accountability, that may be a way to seek it out. But be careful what you wish for, because accountability is dangerous to you. And that's kind of the point, right? You know, once you're a product manager, because I've worked as a product manager at Twitter for a while. Suddenly you feel a lot more vulnerable. Your neck is on the line for the decisions you take, whereas it isn't as much as a designer. The idea of certification or of chartership, no, I don't think we should do that. There are, again, I hear this a lot. There are often people who push for this from an understandable perspective, but sometimes it's motivated by bluntly, and I'm not saying it's the case in this instance, so forgive me, I'm not trying to insult whoever's asked the question, but sometimes that originates from almost a desire to make designers seem more important and influential, and say, well, doctors, they have Hippocratic oaths, they can be struck off, lawyers, mechanical engineers, and so on, they have chartership. Why shouldn't we? The things we make are just as important as those. Well, they're not. They're not as important as those. We don't make life and death decisions yet. We may do later, in which case we revisit the answer to that question. Certification would exacerbate some of our ivory tower tendencies, which I think are bad enough already. They would make us more arrogant, and they're completely unenforceable because there's no third party able to act upon them. The reason that it works in medicine, engineering, and so on is you have a professional organization with the power to chuck someone out of the industry, and you have regulations that allow people to be imprisoned for malpractice. Those don't really exist, and perhaps they shouldn't exist. I will say that our professional organizations need to step up. I've ranted at quite a few people on various boards to say, why aren't they being more active in this space? Because if it were the case that the IXDA or UXPO or someone was more vocal about ethics, I'm not saying necessarily creating a code of conduct or a standard, but more vocal about it, then that would arm us as designers better for those ethical discussions. We could say, well, my professional organization says I shouldn't do this, so therefore I'm not going to. So I think chartership is a step too far. But accountability inside companies, yes, absolutely, we should seek that out.
That's actually a good question from Lisa that sort of ties into this. She's asking, should there be an ethical committee inside a company, like there is at universities when it comes to research and such topics? Have you seen that in practice, or? Yep.
Yeah. My answer is maybe, but probably not. But it depends, of course. It depends on the nature of the work. If it's fairly low ethical risk stuff, such as button placement in an interface, there may still be some ethical questions within that. But creating an ethical committee, I think for me is something of a last resort, or it's something you really should step delicately into, because they're exactly the kind of things that businesses hate, particularly Silicon Valley. They look at ethics committees and they say they're essentially directly oppositional to everything they believe in. They believe in moving fast and breaking things. They believe in rapid innovation. They believe in empiricism. And an ethics committee is slow and it's ponderous and it's ivory tower philosophy kind of people talking about values and touchy-feely things. So I'm paraphrasing. I'm putting words in their mouth. That's obviously not how I see it. So if you create one of those and the company's not ready for it, that will not work. However, there will be times where, I think you do need that sort of thing. That Facebook study I talked about at the start, Facebook didn't have an internal panel for it. Stanford University, of course, did. They have an IRB, an Institutional Review Board, which is what you're talking about there. But the IRB basically said it was Facebook's problem, and so it just slipped through the cracks. So there may be, with high-risk research projects or high-risk ethical decisions, DeepMind, for instance, I think do this well. They've got an ethical panel or an ethical advisory panel. I don't think they sit to sort of be ethical arbiters. I don't think they sort of pass judgment and say this is fine and this isn't. But they have very, very well-respected tech ethicists advising that company. So, I mean, they recognize that the work they do is high risk. They've already been fined and, thrown in a lot of trouble over their handling of NHS data in the UK. So for some applications, a structure like that makes sense. For most tech companies, unless they're large or very innovative or high risk, it's probably a step too far. Start slow and then work toward that if it's required.
All right. I think we're coming to an end. Thank you very much. I have one last question. Where can people connect with you? Twitter, email, whatever. Where can we reach you?
Sure. Okay. So Twitter's probably the best. Let me just copy handle in here. So the nice thing about having a name like mine is I'm very easy to find. So I'm at Cennydd on Twitter. My website is cennydd.com. Which needs a total overhaul, but I'm just too busy. And then finally, of course, I'll put in the book website, future-ethics.com, where you can connect in depth with some of my ideas about this topic.
Awesome. Kenneth, thank you very, very much for your deep insights into the future of ethics. And with this, we'd like to conclude the interview. And don't forget to sign up for UX Live next week. If you don't have a ticket yet and you happen to be in London, there's still tickets left. All right. Thank you very, very much. And
thank you.
Talk next week. Bye-bye.
See you, folks.